Hi, this is Cindy from Vintage to New with another pattern tutorial. This is my super simple little knit dress. It's for sizes 3 months to 36 months. It has a one-piece front, a one-piece back, little flutter sleeves. It has a little contrast hem, and you work it using single fold bias tape, and you can buy that in the notions department of your fabric store. The front will look like this when you cut it out, and then there's a mark on your pattern that says elastic, where the elastic goes, and so just mark a line. I used a pencil, a light pencil, on the inside right where that line is there. So that's the front. The back should look something like this. It should have a keyhole opening here in the back, and then I also marked the line across right there where the elastic goes. When you're cutting out your sleeves, they're placed on the fold, and then there's a line that says gather between the lines, and so I cut just a little notch, and I will gather between the two notches when I get ready to put the sleeve in. So you need to mark that from your pattern to your pattern pieces. So I did some stay stitching around the neck of the front, around the keyhole of the back, and around the neck in the back. And all this does is it helps me not to stretch that fabric when I'm sewing, so I won't get any puckers. One thing I did not mention is you should be using a ballpoint or a stretch needle in your sewing machine when you're sewing on knits. Here is the shoulder seam that I sewed. Look in your owner's manual and find a stretch stitch to use here. Be sure to back stitch at the beginning and end of your seam, and then I just used a regular zigzag stitch to overcast the edge. I did trim it down. I sewed this at a 3/8, then I trimmed it down to about a little over a quarter and overcast the edge. Of course, if you have a serger, you would just run it through the serger really quick and move on. Okay, I'm just getting ready to start. So I have it so that my raw edges are together. I'm being very careful not to pull this neck to stretch it. I'm going to make it so that it goes through my machine straight this way. I'm not going to be trying to turn it like this. I'm going to keep this part going straight. I'm going to line up those raw edges, and I'm going to very carefully sew right down that fold. And then as I work my way around and I get more to the curve, I'm going to move this underneath and then just keep sewing straight, and then make it so that your needle stops down when you stop sewing. Okay, and then very carefully just keep moving this and keeping it nice and flat, working my way around that neck all the way back to the other back side. I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. So here is what our bias tape looks like going around the neck at this point. You can see that there's no puckers or pulls or anything like that. It's very nice and flat. So now the next step we're going to do is we're going to look on the inside, and you see where that seam is that we sewed right there. We're going to fold the bias tape down so that it just covers that. I mean, just barely covers it. It's going to look something like this. Then we're going to sew it from the right side so that we can keep a very nice little top stitch going right along that edge, and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, we have it in our machine now, and we're just going to just keep turning it so that the edge of the bias tape just covers that seam that we have in the back, and then we're going to sew a very nice little top stitch very close to the edge all the way around, and I'll show you what that looks like when I'm done. So this is what our neck will look like at this point. You'll have a very nice finish here on the front. It will look something like this on the inside, which is fantastic. And on the back, you'll see that it goes a little bit over the edge, and at this point you will trim it to the right spot, just so that it goes the same as the seam here in the back. Okay, so then we move on to doing the keyhole. Okay, this keyhole in the back looks a little bit intimidating to try to put bias tape on, but if you'll notice, when it's like this, it looks like a very sharp corner, but when you do it out flat like this, it goes relatively flat. So this is the way we're going to approach this keyhole in the back. We're going to apply our bias tape the same, and so my only thing is, on each side of the center back, leave yourself a good inch and a half at the top on both sides, and I'll show you why when I get there. Okay, we're sewing the back keyhole right now, and I've worked myself down to where that bottom curve is, and so we're just going to work this really slowly through our machine. We're going to go a few steps, and then we're going to adjust it so that we keep this part going in nice and straight. And you can see that it gets a little bit bunchy over here, but that's okay. You just want to keep working it in so that it goes nice and straight with no wrinkles or tucks or anything like that. Okay, I'm almost through that bottom and just about ready to go back up the other side. If you're new to this, you know, this might seem a little intimidating, but if you take your time and just keep working it nice and gently through, it will go really well for you. We're just about back up to the top. You see all that extra bulk we have right there, but we don't have any under our presser foot. It's nice and flat under our presser foot. And again, we're not pulling or stretching our knit fabric in any way as we do this. So here we are, back up to the front. I'm going to cut it off, leaving a good inch and a half at the end. Okay, so here's what the keyhole should look like at this point. You can see that it's nice and flat. There's no puckers or any you know, things that you don't want. It's just going to lay nice and flat. So the next thing we're going to do is just like before. We're going to fold our bias tape over and we're going to sew it like this. Okay, I have folded over my bias tape like we did before, but this time I have this big long leg right here, and so I'm going to start sewing a little farther back, up in here a little bit. I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, I've already sewed a little bit of that leg, and so now I'm just going to continue sewing along, top stitching it down like we did around the neck, all the way around the keyhole. Okay, now you can see the keyhole and how it lays nice and flat. It's on the outside. The inside looks good, and now we have these two long ends here, and I will show you what we're going to do with those. To do the closure in the back, we're going to use either about an 1.5 inch piece of 1/8 inch wide elastic, or if you would rather use a hair tie, we just want something that's going to be stretchy and something we can sew into this seam. So let me show you how we get started. Okay, so our goal is we're going to fold this piece back on itself like that, but we're going to put the ends of our elastic in that little fold, and we're going to make sure it's pinched up together nice and tight so it looks nice and neat. All I need to have is enough of this elastic to be able to go over a button that we're going to sew on the other side. So I don't need quite that much, and it would depend on what size button you decide to use, but something about like that looks good. So now I'm going to put this in my machine, and I'm going to top stitch it down right along that edge right there, and I'm going to be sure that I have caught both edges of this elastic really well in that seam, because there's going to be a lot of pulling that happens on that. So here it is sewn into place, and I backstitched several times over that. On the inside it looks like this, so I'm going to trim these off like so. Then I'm going to just trim off the end. I only sewed down that far. So here is what this one side looks like, and I've tested it several times to be sure that it's very securely attached. On the opposite side, I have trimmed this down so that it's about 1/2 inch. Then I'm going to turn it to the back and I'm just going to top stitch that down into place to give me a nice finished edge right here. And eventually I'm going to sew a button there, and then this little closure will go over and catch the button. So here's what the finished side on this side looks like. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is attach the elastic on the inside of the dress, and you'll notice that the elastic is just a little bit smaller than the actual bodice of the dress to give it a little bit of shaping. So what we're going to do, the first thing, is we're going to mark the center of our elastic. Okay, so this is the center back of our little dress, and here is the center of our elastic. So when we start sewing this on, we're going to start sewing at the underarm here in the side seam, and we're going to stretch it so that that center mark will line up with the center mark there, and then we'll stretch it so that it goes to the other side. And we're going to sew this on using a zigzag stitch. Let me show you what that looks like. Okay, so here's my elastic, here's the side seam. I've already set my machine to a zigzag. You can see the line that I drew from the pattern, traced it onto here. I'm going to give it just a couple little stitches to kind of hold it into place, and on your zigzag you want it to be a fairly loose zigzag, so a long distance between your stitches. Okay, and then here is that center of the garment in the center of my elastic. I'm going to put those together, and then I'm going to give it a little pull so that it's nice and tight on the inside. I'm just going to keep zigzagging, and as I get closer I'm going to make sure that I'm still got that in the center and that I'm going over my line that we drew on. And then as we get to the other side, you'll see that it's going to be short, so you'll pull it so that it goes to the other side, and we'll just continue on doing the same thing by sewing and stretching at the same time, making sure that we're sewing right on the line from the pattern all the way off the edge. So here's what your elastic looks like once you've attached it on the outside. This is what it looks like on the inside, and you will repeat these steps on the front, doing the exact same thing. The first thing we're going to do on our sleeves is we're going to put a small hem in the bottom. I used one of my little stretch stitches. It kind of does a little zigzag. I just turned it up and stitched it like that. If you have a serger, this would be the perfect place to use a little rolled hem right there along that edge. So whatever you use, just do a really small little finishing hem along the flat side of the arm. Okay, so I've run a gathering stitch between the marks that were on the pattern, and then I'm going to pull it up so that it gathers. Okay, and I'm going to make that fit here in the arm opening. Okay, so the first thing you do is you pin one side, you pin the other side, you find the center of your sleeve and you pin it in the center of the shoulder, and then you'll just work it so that the rest of it fits right in, and pin it so that you know that it's right, and then sew a 3/8 inch seam from one arm to the other arm. So I've gone ahead and I've sewn that on. I checked on the front side to be sure that it looks like I want it to look, and it looks just adorable. All the little gathers right up here at the top. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to pull out my gathering stitch, because sometimes that causes trouble. It just continues to want to keep it pulled up. Okay, so that's out. Now I'm going to trim this up to be about 1/4 inch, and then I'm just going to zigzag over that. If you have a serger, of course, you could have just serged this seam on. So here is what it looks like with the sleeve all set in. So now I'm going to turn it so that it's right sides together like this. Then I'm going to line up the underarm. Your elastic should be pretty close to matching, and then your all the way down the side seam, the hem line should match. So I'm going to sew a 3/8 inch seam all the way down from the tip of the underarm of the sleeve all the way to the hem. Okay, so I used my stretch stitch, did the seam all the way down the side, overcast. If you had a serger, you could just do that really quick in one pass. And so now here is the little dress with the sleeve all attached, and you'll repeat all the steps for the other side. Okay, so now we're ready to work on the hem of our little dress. And so I've taken the hem piece, folded it in half, wrong sides together, and I've laid out my dress so that it goes from side seam to side seam and it's laying nice and flat. Now, without stretching the dress or stretching the hem piece, start exactly on the side, and here's my raw edge to raw edge, like I would be sewing it. And I'm just going to measure across the bottom, like so, matching it completely across till I get to the other side. And then I'm going to put a pin in it right on the edge. So that would be halfway because we have a front and a back. So I'm going to measure it around this way. So here is the pin that we marked that was exactly the size of going across the bottom front. I'm doubling it over so it will be exactly the size of going across the back. Then I'm going to cut it, leaving behind just enough that I can do a 1/2 inch seam, like so. Now I'm going to sew it together. Okay, so I said 1/2 inch earlier, I meant my 3/8 inch seam. So I sewed a 3/8 inch seam, then I trimmed it down to remove just some of the bulk, and now I'm going to go ahead and fold it back up after I've opened the seam up to get it nice and flat. And this is what it's going to look like, and I'm just going to put a pin in this to help hold it closed. Like that. So now I'm going to pin this all the way around the bottom of my skirt. I'm going to put the seam in the center back, and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so when I pinned this on, I marked the center front and the center back of my hem and the sides, and then I did the center front and center back of the dress and the sides, and made sure that everything is going to fit nice and neatly without having to do any stretching or pulling of either one. And now I'm going to go back in and add a few more pins and then sew my 3/8 inch seam all the way around the bottom. So I've completely sewn on the hem around the bottom. If you have a serger, you could use your serger and sew it on. I did it at 3/8, trimmed it off to a 1/2, and then zigzagged to finish the edge. The next thing we're going to do is to push the hem up towards the dress this way, and we're going to run a top stitch right along this edge right here. So I'm running the top stitch along the edge here. I have decreased the pressure on my presser foot just a little bit so it's not pushing so hard to get the fabric through. And then I've also lengthened the stitch of my straight stitch just a little bit. You want it to be as flat as possible going through your machine so that you don't get any waves. So anyway, continue all the way around. So here is the hem of our little dress. It looks like this on the outside, and looks like that on the inside. If you end up with some little waves in it, just press it with your iron and it will go nice and flat. Okay, we're going to make the bow for the front now, and I have just used another piece of the material we used for the hem, but you can use a scrap of any fabric you want. This happens to be 8 inches long, so my bow is going to be just slightly over 4 inches, or slightly under 4 inches this way when I'm done. Overlap it just maybe like a 1/2 inch, like that, and we're going to sew across the top and across the bottom. So you can see I've sewn across the top and the bottom, and now I'm going to take it through this little opening here and turn it right side out, like so. Then I'm going to use a chopstick or something like that just to gently poke out those corners, and I'll poke out all 4 corners. It'll look something like this when you're done. Okay, I'm going to take another little scrap of that fabric, and I'm going to push both of the raw edges in towards the middle, and then I'm going to put both folded edges up together so it looks something like this, and that's what's going to go around the center of the bow. Let me show you what I mean. So here's that piece that I had folded all of the raw edges in, and I'm holding it in the back. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take it over to my machine and I'm going to sew as close as I can to the bow without sewing the bow, just sewing that closed right across there. Okay, the whole thing comes out looking like this. So I want to trim off this little piece right here really close to the seam that I sewed. All right. And now I'm going to take just a little bit of time and I'm going to work this bow so that I get the little gathers here in the center so they look really nice. All right. So it's going to look something like that when I'm done. Okay, I found the center front of the dress and I pulled the elastic out so that I could find the center front and get this nice and centered right in the center of the dress. And you can attach this bow however you would like. You could hand sew it on from the back, or I'm going to sew it on the machine and I'll show you what that looks like. So when I sewed it on using my machine, I sewed it right very close to that little center piece right there so that when it's like this you can hardly see it. But it's sewn clear through the dress right there, right at the elastic. Okay, the last thing I did was go through my button jar and I found a little button that I liked for this dress. When you're sewing this button on, it would make this closure stronger if some of your stitches went through the bias tape here instead of only through the knit. On this one, the top two parts of the buttonhole went through this and the others went through the knit. So anyway, and then it would go through the little closure like so, and your dress is done. So I hope you enjoyed this pattern and this tutorial. So until next time, thanks for stopping by, and this is Cindy from Vintage to New.